that, you know, I mean, for me, and also, I mean, I was thinking about this. I mean, you know, I think so much of the time I see people and they say, you know, they try to organize people around big, let's take, you know, huge issues, not recognizing that people don't think, how can I make a difference on that? And I think, I mean, what you want is a society where there's enough people paying attention to the small issues that some of the bigger issues go away. I mean, if we'd had an if we had a really socially engaged, low-income community, but you couldn't have, across the country, you couldn't have started a big, expensive war like the one in Iraq without talking about, well, what are we going to have to sacrifice to do that? I mean, you would at least have to have that discussion about, is it worth cutting funding for health care and other programs in this country to do that one? And we didn't have that discussion because the people impacted weren't already involved and didn't already have a voice.
Well,
I was just wondering whether the apathy perhaps here or lack of courage is related to this state. Do you have enough contact with people in other states who are more engaged and more expressing their thoughts or their concerns in outward civil disobedience?
I can comment briefly on that. I moved here from upstate New York 30 years ago in September. And I came from an area of New York, State University of New York, Binghamton was a pretty radical and active place, even through the 70s and into the 80s. So when I got here and found out things weren't quite as activist, I was kind of taken aback. And I don't know if that's because generally, it's not just the LDS Church, but I think maybe many of the religious denominations, because of the influence of that rather conservative religious orientation that emphasizes perhaps more compliance and obedience than it does activism, has had a pervasive effect. So it's hard to get people who think of morality as doing what God wants or what the church says or what the bishop says or what the priest says or the rabbi says to do things that demand breaking free from that sense of obedience. I'm not sure that that's peculiar to this state, though. I think there are other states like this. Just my upbringing was different, though. I mean, my high school and college was all riddled with radical Marigold and Jesuit priests, to my mother's horror, especially since I refused to become a priest. So it was that they corrupted me somehow. I mean, one of my religion teachers in the 12th grade in seminary was Phil Berrigan, who'd been kicked out of, we didn't have any place else to put him apparently in Maryville, so they stuck him with us for a year, and then they got rid of him and realized what he was doing was further radicalizing us. But I mean, when I came out here, I didn't see that kind of thing initially, but I must say this parish here has been pretty amazing in the activism it has illustrated with regard to social justice. Over the period of time I've been associated with it directly or indirectly, I've been very impressed with St. Mark's.
Camille?
I was very amused at the beginning of the panel when Bill asked us to vote on what we considered a legitimate act of civil disobedience and what we did not. There was quite a marked difference between the vote supporting Tim DeChristopher and the Southern Utah ATV riders who were going to not take it anymore and take back Utah. Maybe I'm not listening clearly enough, but I have not heard from any of you what I would consider a working definition of what is, in fact, legitimate civil disobedience. And I think that that was kind of illustrated by that vote.
Can I respond to that? I'll tell you why, because controversially there isn't a widely accepted one.
Well, I'd love to hear what your personal definitions are.
I'm afraid I'm influenced by Rawls too much. He gave me the Rawlsian definition, and I still have problems with that. But I mean, there isn't any widely agreed upon definition of it. That's why there's different traditions about what constitutes the justification for it, and in terms of necessary conditions.
What would you consider a legitimate case for civil disobedience?
Well,
clearly the ATV riders felt their comfort.
No, because their material risk was at risk, and that's what they were complaining about, rather than some issue that was broader than their own interests, namely a question of preventable harm or a matter of justice. It doesn't involve directly my own interests. That's what Amos is talking about too. That's where I think civil disobedience may, in fact, or direct action or something stronger may be required, and nobody will pay attention finally. There's a grotesque injustice and it's just being allowed to happen, like preventable harm. I mean, Bill mentioned the figures about poverty in this country. Well, worldwide, 18 million people will die because of deep poverty, as caused by poverty, not from other indirect or collateral damage from warfare, but 18 million people this year will die because of poverty. Actually, it's higher. I think that's actually just the children's numbers. Because of poor nutrition, inadequate water, the environment is deteriorated or incapable of really supporting life beyond mere survival. And yet, there's that kind of harm nobody says anything about. That seems to me, when people demonstrated at the International Monetary Fund meetings, the G20 summit recently, that kind of civil disobedience is an attempt to call attention to those kinds of grotesque injustices. That's preventable harm. We could do something about it, but the G20 nations don't, or at least not adequately. That's the kind of thing I think represents an exemplar of civil disobedience.
Yeah,
So I think the problem with having a definition of what is civilly disobedient, it becomes case specific instead of a mindset. What bothers me about civil disobedience, I would rather think of it as civil responsibility and obligation.
Well, civic republicanism, good citizens step up when it's the hardest to do so.
It's the definition of republicans. Hold our lawmakers' feet to the fire.
That's civic republicanism.
Carolyn.
Have you talked about the influence of the media on all this? Because I came in late. Because what I was thinking about is that before the Iraq War, there was an enormous demonstration in New York City, and I know people that were there. It was huge, and it was not reported. Was certainly not reported locally, but you know what I mean? They said, oh, well, there were a few people. You know, they were all the way back to Central Park. It was huge, and I don't know, maybe you already made the point, but that our media has gotten so co-opted that it's hard, even when a significant groundswell occurs.
Any comments on that?
Both of these guys have mentioned about how if you don't get the media involved, somehow to report this and make, because that's the point of an act of disobedience, is to call attention to an injustice. But calling attention to it requires some kind of reporting about it and getting people to pay attention by putting it on the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news or whatever. And if the media doesn't show up, then the act of disobedience kind of, sure, does the tree make a sound when it falls in the forest and no one's around?
Well, I just think it's almost, I read a short story when I was in high school about everybody got their information from television, and it turned out there was nothing outside, you know, because nobody ever went outside, because, I mean, it seems to me that we're getting there really fast, where we're, do you know what I mean, we're not.
It's kind of explored in the Matrix trilogy movies.
I think, I mean, for me, the one thing I've observed as somebody who's organized a few different types of protests and activities, you know, is that I think if you organize something solely for the impact on the media, the media is less likely to come. I mean, with this event, everybody in the governor's office is going to remember when the weird group of people showed up with these masks. I mean, they're going to say, I mean, that's you know, and whether or not the media pays attention. The other thing I'd say is that we are in this interesting time where, you know, I mean, I actually, you know, the traditional media are losing